Week 13 of the fantasy football season, and here's wide receiver start sits every matchup this week. So now back to a full slate in Week 13, every team playing. Obviously, 3 games on Thanksgiving, then a Black Friday game, and then the normal schedule. So the first game every year since Chicago Bears at the Detroit Lions. DJ Moore had a breakout game last week, over 100 yards, found the end zone for the Chicago Bear team. And the Bears, obviously, they threw their way back into the ball game, and they threw nonstop in the second half. So Moore, Keenan Allen, and Dunze all had big games, with DJ Moore the only guy I really buy into this week. This is going to be another game, I believe, where they're going to be trailing early and often at a great Detroit Lion team. And they're going to have to throw a whole lot. So DJ Moore, I think he goes out there, has another nice performance. In the last 2 weeks, the numbers have gone up. Keenan Allen, I know he had 9 catches, 86-yard touchdown, which was his best game of the season overall for this Bear team. But all season long, we really haven't seen much. And like I said, a lot of prevent and garbage time points until they tied it up and went to overtime. So Keenan Allen this week, I don't trust he's a sit. Roma Dunze, yes, he had 10 targets, but it didn't amount much in terms of fantasy points. So once again, he's been inconsistent all season long. In his rookie year, he's a sit. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's a start each and every week. One of the best receivers in fantasy football, and you're on one of the best offense. Jameson Williams, not a great game, but he still was productive. 5 catches, 64 yards in that ball game. And J-Mo, I know sometimes he's been a boomer bust wide out, but he's definitely been a nice part of the offense all season long. So this week in a matchup versus a Bears secondary, it's been leaky over the last few weeks. Jameson Williams is a start as well. New York Giants at the Dallas Cowboys. Malik Neighbors is a start. The thing with Malik Neighbors, these games, it seems like he gets off to a slow start, and then when they got to play catch-up and a lot of garbage time, he finishes up with 14, 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So this week in a matchup at the Cowboys, they haven't stopped anyone all season long. We saw it last week. They were up 27-20 with a little time left. And Terry McLaurin houses a big 86-yard touchdown. And Malik Neighbors, we know he's explosive. We know he goes out there and make plays. Him and Tommy DeVito obviously weren't on the same page. We had a goose egg in the first half of the game last week. But I think Neighbors versus secondary could go out there and have a nice performance. Wan'Dale Robinson, I said early in the year, he had a good start to the season and was a fantasy option. But the numbers really haven't been there for Wan'Dale Robinson. I know him and Tommy DeVito have some rapport from last season. But this week, even in a good matchup at the Cowboys, he's a sit. CeeDee Lamb, he's locked in as a start weekly. I know the numbers are definitely taking a hit, but the last couple weeks actually been pretty solid numbers here for CeeDee Lamb. So Lamb, obviously he's a bust where he's taken 2nd, 4th overall pick range in fantasy drafts this season. But with Cooper Rush, he's making the most of it, and he's been putting up numbers the last couple weeks. Jalen Tolbert to sit. I know he found the end zone last week in that ball game at the Commanders in the upset victory for the Dallas Cowboys. But the thing is, Tolbert, if he didn't get that touchdown, wasn't doing much. And pretty much like it was with Dak Prescott, the top options are CeeDee Lamb and the tight end position, if it's Ferguson or Luke Schoonmaker for Cooper Rush. So this week in a good matchup even versus the Giants, he's a sit. Miami Dolphins at the Packers, 3rd game and night game of Thanksgiving. Tyreek Hill will start. I know the numbers haven't been great to the elite level like they were with Tua back in the lineup, but we know Tyreek Hill's not 100%. He's dealing with the wrist injury, and he's banged up overall as well. But this week at Green Bay, a secondary that obviously they've been up and down all season long. I know last week they went out there and blew the doors off, obviously, the 49ers, but with a banged-up Brock Purdy not playing, that was part of it, obviously, as well. So Tyreek Hill, I think he's a start. Jalen Waddle finally broke out and had his biggest game easily of the season, over 120 yards, finding the end zone for this Miami Dolphin team. But this week in a tougher matchup versus Green Bay, where last week was a cupcake matchup versus New England Patriots. I think Waddle, he's going to go back down a little bit in production. And like I said, he didn't do much all season long, where that was only his 2nd double-digit fantasy game all year in PPR weeks. I still don't trust him 100%, so he's a flex option. Green Bay Packers, Jaden Reed, he's a start. They're banged up in the receiving room a little bit. Romeo Doubs, he's got a concussion. Christian Watson, Datavian Wicks, they didn't do much. Pretty much it was the Josh Jacobs show last week. And obviously, Tucker Kraft found the end zone. But Jaden Reed, he's been slumping, no doubt about it, the last few weeks. But this week in a potential high-scoring game, and we know these Thursday night games usually are high-scoring. I think Reed goes out there, has a bounce-back game. Christian Watson, Datavian Wicks, every other week it seems like these guys put up numbers to get targets. And I know with the Romeo Doubs injury, I don't believe he's going to clear concussion protocol in a couple days before the game. But I just don't think Christian Watson and Wicks week in and week out are options. I know some weeks they're going to have games, but it's tough to play Obviously, the week they're going to go off, and especially with a full slate, they're both sits. Next game, Las Vegas Raiders at the Kansas City Chiefs. Jacoby Myers, he's a start for me in this game. Last week, he had a big game for this Vegas Raider team with Patrick Surtain covering him a majority of the game. So Myers, it's been a great season for him, no doubt about it. And him and Brock Bowers was the only 2 targets in this passing game all season long that are fantasy options. I know quarterback now with Minshew out for the season, and they don't come back to the lineup this week for this Vegas Raider team. Black Friday ball game, Jacoby Myers is a start. Trey Tucker is a sit. I know Tucker, I recommended him as an ad this week, and definitely I still would go out there in 12-team leagues or deeper and get Tucker on my roster. But as a week-in, week-out starter, I don't think he has that value. We know he's the number 2 wide receiver on this Vegas Raider team, but with a tough matchup versus Kansas City defense team playing, I just don't think he's a start this week. DeAndre Hopkins a start. Last week, not a monster game, but he had the 5 catches, 35 yards, and a touchdown. And a decent option for fantasy football owners is DeAndre Hopkins, way better than what he was over there with the Tennessee Titans. So this week versus secondary that can't stop anyone, I think Hopkins goes out there once again to start. Xavier Worthy is sit. I know Xavier Worthy had the big game at the Buffalo Bills in Week 11, but last week he didn't do much in that game. It was a mediocre to quiet performance for the most part. And this Kansas City Chief team, I just don't get it. I've been saying it for weeks that they got to find ways to get Xavier Worthy in space and use his speed to his advantage, but it just obviously hasn't come to fruition for the majority of the season. So this week, he's a sit for me. Houston Texans at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Nico Collins, he's back. He looks like he didn't miss a beat. Found the end zone, 90 yards in that ball game for Nico Collins. Him and C.J. Stroud locked in, and it was a tough loss, no doubt about it, versus a bad Titan team in last week's game. But Nico Collins, he goes out there weekly, puts up his numbers. Tank Dell, he's been solid now as the number 2 wide receiver with Stephon Diggs out for the season. And this week in a great matchup at a bad Jacksonville secondary, he's a start. Brian Thomas Jr. a start. The only option in the receiving room right now. Gabe Davis out for the season. Christian Kirk out for the season. Parker Washington, you're not going to get much out of him. So Thomas, he's going to get peppered with targets. And the offense in the passing game pretty much is Thomas, Evan Ingram. And this secondary last week had problems versus Ridley and Westbrook-Ikhine, so he's a start. Chargers at the Atlanta Falcons. Ladd McConkey, he's a start for me. He's the number 1 option in the passing game for this Los Angeles Charger team. He's going to run all the routes. Him and Justin Herbert have a good rapport, and he's got great hands, and he reminds me of a mini Cooper Kupp, is Ladd McConkey. So this week on the fast track in Atlanta, I think he'd go out there and have a good game. Quentin Johnson, he's a sit for me. He's pretty much been a touchdown to nothing all season long. And last week, 2 bad drops for Quentin Johnson in that ball game versus the Baltimore Ravens. So this week, he's a no-brainer sit. Now to the Falcons, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, both starts. Drake London, it's been a good season for him with Kirk Cousins in his first season as the Atlanta Falcon quarterback. They have a good rapport. Drake London, he was a second, third-round pick going into fantasy drafts, and he's definitely lived up to the bill most weeks than not for this Atlanta Falcon team. So this week in a potential high-scoring game between these two teams, the Chargers defense the last couple weeks hasn't played well. London goes out there as a good game, and Darnell Mooney, he's a good deep ball threat, good yard after catch, obviously wide receiver. And him and Kirk Cousins have had a good rapport over the last few weeks where Mooney's popped off for a couple big games. So I know he's a little banged up with the hamstring injury, but he should be good to go. And he's definitely a start this week, is Darnell Mooney. Tennessee Titans at the Commanders. Calvin Ridley, ever since the DeAndre Hopkins deal, he's been one of the best receivers in fantasy football, and he's putting up double-digit fantasy points 4 out of the last 5 weeks. So this week in a matchup at the Commanders, where their defense all of a sudden has gone the other way, where a Dallas Cowboy team with tons of injuries on the offensive line and Dak Prescott out for the season. Jake Ferguson was out, went in there, and they put up 34 points on the board. So I think Calvin Ridley goes out there. He has a productive game. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, he's definitely a flex option to me in deeper leagues. 5 out of 6 games, he's found the end zone. Him and Will Levis have a good rapport. I know he's not getting a lot of receptions, and he's been the ultimate boom or bust type of wide receiver, but he just has a knack for the end zone, and he's been a great deep ball threat for the Commanders. Terry McLaurin, the only option in the passing game that's worth talking about as a fantasy option. And Scary Terry, what a year it's been with him and Jaden Daniels in Daniels' rookie season. So last week, the monster game, pulling off the fourth quarter heroics, even though the missed extra point did the Commanders in to tie the game. But Scary Terry this week versus Titans secondary, I think goes out there. Game Arizona Cardinals, the Minnesota Vikings. This week, this could be a potential high-scoring game. And last week, we saw this Cardinal team. They didn't score the football well. And Marvin Harrison, it's just been an up-and-down rookie season for him. One good week, one bad week, where when you got a quarterback like Kyler Murray, obviously he's going to run the football a whole lot. There's times he's not going to get the football to his top targets, and that's exactly been the case with Marvin Harrison. So Harrison coming off a game, 3 catches, only 47 yards, but I'm still going to put him in the starting lineup because his upside, and this would be potentially a high-scoring game. I think he could go out there, Marvin Harrison, and be a good option for fantasy owners because, like I said, it's pretty much been an every other week type of thing. We saw DJ Moore and Keenan Allen go out there and have good games versus Minnesota last week. So Marvin's the start. Michael Wilson not even on the list. I know he had 2 catches, 54 yards, but he really hasn't been an option over the last month of the season. Now to the Vikings, Justin Jefferson. They're double-teaming him a lot and forcing Sam Darnold all the football to other players like TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison. And it's definitely worked, though, for Minnesota. Even with Jefferson double-team with a safety over the top and a corner, they're still going out there producing. And Justin Jefferson, he's due. And I think this week versus the middle of the pack to poor defense of the Cardinals. He goes out there, has a big game. Jordan Addison, a monster game last week, 160 yards receiving, found the end zone. And this week versus the Arizona Cardinals, who didn't play well, sport versus Seattle's wide receivers, I think he's a start this week is Jordan Addison after coming off the game. Indianapolis Colts at the New England Patriots. Josh Downs, it looks like he's going to be out week to week with a shoulder injury. So Michael Pittman is a flex option for me. Had one of his better games last week in the loss versus the Detroit Lions, where he went for 5 catches, 96 yards. But Pittman all season long, numbers really haven't been there. He hasn't been a touchdown threat over the last 2 seasons. And him and Anthony Richardson, for the most part, haven't really been on the same page. So last week was a lot of garbage time towards the end of the game. And at best this week at New England, where it looks like he's going to be operating as the number 1 target in the passing game, is Pittman. He's a flex option. Alec Pierce is a sit. He's pretty much been a boom or bust wide receiver, for the most part a bust. If he's not catching that deep ball and finding the end zone, his numbers haven't been there for Alec Pierce this season. So even in a good matchup versus a bad secondary of the New England Patriots, he's a sit. Demario Douglas is a sit for me in this game. I know Demario Douglas, you could arguably say he's the number 1 option in the passing game, or Hunter Henry for this New England Patriots team playing this week in a full slate. I don't see Douglas putting up much. I know the last 4 weeks, 9 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. I know the secondary of the Indianapolis Colts isn't all that great, but Demario Douglas, with everyone back, it's going to be tough for fantasy owners to put him in the starting lineup. If you have better options, Pittsburgh Steelers at the Cincinnati Bengals. George Pickens is a start. He's the number 1 target. Him and Russell Wilson have a great rapport. And last week in that snowstorm in the second half of that ball game at Cleveland, they just missed on a couple big plays in that one. So I think George Pickens, he could go out there. Great matchup versus Cincinnati, who obviously can't stop anyone all season long. Receivers have gone off for big games. He's a must-start. Mike Williams, Calvin Austin's a sit for me. Both these players not consistent enough, in my opinion, to go out there and put up weekly numbers. And with 16 teams in a full slate this week, I don't see them doing much. And if you got to go to those guys, especially in your basic formats, your team's obviously in trouble. This week, Mike Williams, who had the goose egg last week, I still know he's learning the playbook and stuff. He's a sit. And Calvin Austin did have 78 yards and a touchdown, but he's a sit for me as well. For the Bengals, Jamar Chase, obviously best receiver this season in fantasy football, putting up monster games weekly. It seems like he's a must-start. Him and Burrow really locked in, especially in a contract year for Chase. And T. Higgins as well, he's on the 1-year franchise tag, and he's a start. The games he's played this season, he's been very productive. I know it's a tougher matchup versus a good defense to the Pittsburgh Steelers, but these wide receivers, for the most part, they're matchup-proof, so they start. Seattle Seahawks at the New York Jets. This Jet team, their defense has been overrated all season long. And Seattle, their wide receivers are playing good football. So DK Metcalf, he's been back over the last couple of weeks. I know he hasn't had the monster impact numbers as Metcalf, but he's still a wide receiver. It just takes one big play for him to go out there and have a big ball game. So last week, coming off a 4 for 59 versus Arizona, I think he goes out there. And this is not a secondary that can match the physicality and even the height here of Metcalf, so he's a start. Jackson Smith-Njigba, the last month of the season, he's been one of the best receivers in fantasy football, so he's a must-start as well. Him and Geno Smith, they're really hitting and making plays. And Tyler Lockett's definitely taking a backseat as the veteran receiver. So Metcalf, JSN locked in, Tyler Lockett is sit. Numbers have been inconsistent. The route participation has gone down and the snaps. So this week, he's the third, fourth fiddle in this offense, obviously, for the Seattle Seahawks team. He's a sit. Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, the starts. Garrett Wilson, he's a great talent, no doubt about it. And we've seen Wilson over the years with bad quarterback play still overcome it and be a viable fantasy option. So this week, I think they could put some points on the board where the Seattle defense don't travel well for the most part, and their secondary has been mid at best this season. So Wilson's a start. Devontae Adams, I know he hasn't been great with Aaron Rodgers, and believe it or not, they haven't been on the same page, missing on some routes and stuff like that. But Devontae Adams, more into the playbook a little more, building up the rapport. And this Jet team, if they're trailing early and often, they're going to have to throw a whole lot. So Adams, I would start. Los Angeles Rams at the New Orleans Saints. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, they must start wide receivers. Not much to say about that. They're putting up numbers weekly. Puka Nacua, since the injury, he's come back. He's putting up the huge numbers. Same with Cooper Kupp. Seems like he's finding the end zone weekly. And this week in an indoor game at New Orleans, points will be scored pretty easily, I believe, for the Rams. Valdez-Scantling, Mason Tipton, they're both sits for me. I know MVS, he's gone out there, and he's been a monster deep ball threat for Derek Carr in this offense. But how many weeks in a row is he going to get a 70, 80-yard touchdown? Is Valdez-Scantling. So with a full slate, and like I said, he's pretty much a deep ball and nothing needs to sit. Mason Tipton definitely getting the opportunity with Olave and Rashid Shaheed, who's been out for the season for a while now. But he just hasn't been putting up numbers, and this is an inconsistent offense. Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the Panthers. Mike Evans, he's a start for me in this game. Mike Evans, I know he returned last week in that ball game at the New York Giants in the 30-7 route victory for Tampa Bay, but he didn't do much as Mike Evans in that ball game, getting his legs under him. But this week in a division matchup and a team he's very familiar with, obviously, spending his whole career with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think he goes out there, has a good game at the Carolina Panthers. Their defense all season long has been giving up a lot of points, so he's a must-start. McMillan, Sterling, Shepard, their hits. They're not really doing much in the passing game. Now with Chris Godwin out for the season, pretty much the running backs have picked up some of the targets out of the backfield. And obviously, Cade Otton over the last few weeks, even though he had a down game last week. So even this week in a good matchup, I don't see Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard being good options for fantasy owners with every team on the slate. And this team, I think, is going to get off to an early start like they did last week, Tampa Bay, and run the football second half. Xavier Legette, Adam Thielen, Jalen Coker all sits for me. Xavier Legette definitely should be owned in 12-team leagues or deeper for fantasy owners, but the production hasn't been there week in and week out. His ceiling really hasn't been high in this offense where they're trying to run the football a whole lot with Chuba Hubbard, and he's got a majority of their fantasy points offensively this season. So Legette should be owned, like I said, but this week he's a sit even in the decent match. Adam Thielen, he returned last week, 3 for 57 receiving, a decent ball game in PPR leagues. But like I said, with every team on the slate, these guys' ceilings aren't high in this offense, and they're pretty much guys on your bench. Bye weeks, they're fillers, those players like Adam Thielen, Xavier Legette, but not really starters unless you play in a lot of leagues with flexes or have tons of injuries. And Jalen Coker, he missed last week's ball game. We'll see if he returns this week for the Carolina Panthers. But another player who's been inconsistent and not really an option for fantasy owners. So he's a sit this week. Philadelphia Eagles at the Baltimore Ravens. It's going to be a high-scoring game, in my opinion, this week. A.J. Brown, he's a must-start. One of the best wide receivers in all fantasy football and pro football. Found the end zone once again last week, went over 100 yards. Devonta Smith, we'll see if he returns in this game. We missed last week's ball game with injury for this Philadelphia Eagle team. But Devonta Smith, I know he's taking a back seat a little bit in this offense this year, especially with Saquon Barkley putting up the insane numbers he's been putting up. So Smith, definitely, he's not a full-fledged start weekly, but I think as a top 30 option, he is Zay Flowers. He's a start each and every week. He's going to have some games where he doesn't do much, but he's going to have games where he goes off over 100 yards and find the end zone. And this week versus Philadelphia, definitely a tough matchup where Mitchell, one of the best corners in the league already as a rookie, where he's been shutting down elite receivers all season long. But Zay Flowers, it seems like he finds a way weekly to go out there and put up fantasy points. Rashad Bateman, Deontay Johnson, their sits. Besides Zay Flowers being the number one target in the passing game, this offense is about Derrick Henry running the football a lot, and Lamar Jackson being the playmaker he is as well, running the football. So these two wide receivers, especially Deontay Johnson, who he hasn't done much since he got traded here to Baltimore, and their sits. San Francisco 49ers at the Bills. Deebo Samuel will start. I know last week the numbers weren't good at all for Deebo Samuel, but obviously that was with Allen in there, quarterback, and Brock Purdy being out. So I'm counting on Purdy coming back in this ball game. San Francisco figured If we got to lose one, we'll lose it this week. And if we could get Purdy back to almost 100% of health, we'll get him back for this Bill game. So I think that's the deal here. And Deebo Samuel, we know he's a great talent, but we also know he's definitely been injury prone over the last couple seasons. But this week, Deebo's due for a good game. And I think it comes to Buffalo. Juwan Jennings, Ricky PSO. This hits for me. I know Juwan Jennings and Brock Purdy have the great rapport, and we've seen 2 big games this season here for Juwan Jennings. But like I said, George Kittle's been back. He's back in the lineup now with this 49er team. He had a big game last week, finding the end zone, 20 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And Juwan Jennings, he's definitely been a solid option, no doubt about it. But like I said, with a full slate of games, and now we'll see how he plays with Kittle back in the lineup. He's definitely a player that I have as a sit. And Ricky Pearsall, the last 2 weeks, 2 goose eggs. You can't trust him. He's a sit. Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir starts for me. I know Amari Cooper, he's not 100% dealing with the risk, but now coming off a bye week and learning the playbook even more, I believe, for this Buffalo Bill team. 2 weeks to prepare for this ball game. I think Amari Cooper, he's going to surprise. We know he's got good hands. We know he's still a good route runner. And him and Josh Allen, once they're on the same page, Cooper definitely could break out. I believe him put up numbers as a start. Khalil Shakir, in my opinion, has been the number 1 target all season long in the passing game and the receiving room for this Buffalo Bill team. Pretty much any target in his vicinity, he's been catching over 90% this season, so he's a start, could run all the routes, good slot guy. And Josh Allen, we know he likes that type of wide receiver that could run the out route, run the slant, and work the seam, and that's what Shakir's been doing this season. Curtis Samuel, Matt Collins, this hits for me. I know they've had some games here and there this season, but not enough consistency, and they're pretty much the 4th or 5th options in the offense. In the final game of the week, Monday night, Cleveland Browns at the Denver Broncos. Jerry Jeudy, he's a start, number 1 option in the receiving room for this Brown team. And I know Patrick Surtain, who I think is the best corner in all pro football, is going to be shadowing his former teammate the majority of this game. But Jerry Jeudy and this Brown team, a lot of garbage time we've seen from them this season, even though last week they were playing with a lead a majority of the game. And Jerry Jeudy went out there and he made some big plays, especially down the stretch of that one. So I think in this one, Jerry Jeudy, he's obviously going to be motivated. The Broncos drafted him, traded him in the offseason to Cleveland, and Cleveland gave him his money where Denver didn't want to. And this week, even with Surtain on him, I think he's a startable option. Cedric Tillman banged up with a concussion. We don't know if he's going to play, and even if he does, he's a sit. He's pretty much benefited, obviously, Cedric Tillman, from a lot of garbage time. But in terms of the first few quarters of the ball game, he hasn't done much. It's just been a garbage time type of game for Cedric Tillman. So he's a sit. Elijah Moore, a sit as well. He's had a couple decent games, no doubt about it. Consistent. And pretty much he's a wide receiver going into the week that you'll rank probably in the top 45, top 50. And now to the Broncos, Cortland Sutton to start. The last 5 weeks, he's gone out there. It's either over 100 yards for Cortland Sutton or finding the end zone. So him and Bo Nix are locked in. Bo Nix, he's been one of the better fantasy quarterbacks the last month of the season, putting up numbers. This Bronco offense is definitely taking the next step where they're definitely a threat now. We're one of the best defenses in the league and a good offense now with Bo Nix on the center. They're going out there and they're making plays, and Cortland Sutton's been one of the best wide receivers in fantasy in the last month. And Devon Vele, he's definitely emerged over the last 3 weeks. He had double-digit fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's a big 6'7", 6'8" target, could run the routes, and they needed that number 2 option in the passing game behind Cortland Sutton. So I think Devon Vele in a matchup versus a defense that hasn't been great this season could go out there and be a decent flex option. So that's wide receivers start sit every matchup for week 13 of the fantasy football season.